welcome to Return to Regalia, an Underland Chronicles reread podcast. I'm Una.
And I'm John.
Today we'll be covering Chapter 21 of The Curse of the Warmbloods, in which the Questers enter the Vineyard of Eyes, and Ripred tells the story of the Garden of the Hesperides. What did you think of this chapter, John?
This is a meaty one. There's a lot to dissect here. It's always interesting to see how... I feel like Suzanne Collins almost handles this better in this series than in the Hunger Games, but I love how she's able to introduce characters out of nowhere that have really had no hinting or foreshadowing whatsoever, but it feels very natural. Like, it doesn't feel like a out-of-nowhere insert that doesn't really align with anything, or, like, just seems like a ploy narratively. Like, Hamnet seems very fully formed here. Like, if you had told me this had always been planned, I wouldn't doubt it. But we only are just meeting him. And so it's also great to see. It's only been, 10 chapters since we were introduced to him? And now we get his backstory, and it's so good.
I agree.
That's a little rambling, but...
No, yeah, that's perfect. I think you're absolutely right. Like, Suzanne Collins is really good at making us care about this character who is not even present for this whole book, but leaves such an impression. Like, this is the Hamnet book, you know? He's got so much going on, and this is kind of when we realize how much he's got going on. It's really interesting. I'm really excited to get into it.
Yes, me too.
Where we left off, Luxa and Aurora had just joined the group for the last leg of their journey. Chapter 21 opens with a description of how thick the jungle is getting. The Questers have to part the vines with their hands, and Gregor is careful to stay right alongside Temp and Boots. Hamnet assigns everyone a number so they can count off in order to make sure no one's gotten lost. The problem is that Temp isn't great at counting, and he keeps forgetting that his number comes after Boots's. Boots tries to help Temp by reminding him, "Temp, say 10!" And Gregor worries that this is embarrassing Temp, but the roach doesn't show any discomfort. Luxa falls back in line to walk with Gregor, and he asks how Aurora is. She says she's doing better, then asks who Hazard is. Gregor reveals that Hazard is Luxa's cousin and explains that he's a Halflander. Luxa looks conflicted about having a new cousin, and Gregor says, "I think he'll be a good one, like Nerissa or Howard," which is really sweet.
Very sweet.
I like that Gregor picks up on the whole, oh yeah, Luxa has not had great luck with cousins in the past. She's probably really apprehensive about getting a new one, especially, a Halflander who's, lived in the jungle his whole life. He's so different from her. Luxa asks if Nerissa is queen now, and Gregor says yes. Luxa will be queen again when she gets back, though, and she says, "I will not be relieved of this crown so easily." I really love this part because she, is saying, she's, acting like she doesn't want the crown. She's like, "I won't be relieved of it so easily." But, she kept wearing her crown.
Oh, she does not, she does not want to give it up at all.
Yeah,
she's
no.
Queen through and through.
Yeah, she chose to keep the crown, and she's choosing to come back to Regalia with them and, help on this quest right now. So even though she jokes about how she doesn't want to be queen, you're not fooling anyone.
No.
Luxa, you definitely, want to be queen, not for the sake of power, but, you want to be there for your people, and you understand your responsibility, and you're, rising to meet it.
You're a good ruler, but you're not a reluctant one.
Yes. I think it's also really interesting because later on we're going to get Luxa talking to Gregor about how she thinks that it was wrong for Hamnet to stay away in the jungle for so long. And I think that's interesting coming from someone like Luxa because she is the exact opposite. She knows her responsibility and would not give it up and rises to the challenge of being queen, and she would never abandon her people willingly. So it's really a foreign concept to her that Hamnet would just leave everything that he knows behind to live in the jungle. And yeah, she just doesn't understand that. I think that makes sense for her character, though.
It makes sense. It also helps that she hasn't committed a war crime like Hamnet has.
That's true too.
Because Hamnet's whole thing of he doesn't want to do any more harm, it's that doesn't compute for Luxa because she hasn't done any harm yet, and even though she's in a royal position, so she doesn't see that as something that might end up happening. She's so locked into imagining that she will be a good ruler, and she probably will be a good ruler, but it means that she hasn't really considered some of the difficult, impossible choices that sometimes end up with you committing atrocities.
Yeah.
And the weight that takes on you, and the regret which Hamnet has, which we'll talk about more soon.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's a great sign. Was like, yes, there's a big contrast between Luxa and Hamnet. And Luxa's not abandoning her post, but she's also still a child.
Right.
Hamnet has a child. He's lived. I mean, obviously, Luxa's lived through a lot, but Hamnet's lived through a lot and done a lot.
Right.
That he has to feel horrible about.
Yes, yeah, there is a big difference there. And you're right that Luxa has not fully comprehended the evilness of Regalia yet.
Yeah.
And Hamnet does.
And he wants no part of it. And I think that's the main difference, that Hamnet, like, sees what Regalia is and wants to leave it behind. He doesn't want to be part of that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Even if Luxa did see it, I feel like she wouldn't abandon it. She would try to resolve it. She would try to make it better than what it is. But also, right now, I don't think she has, like you said.
Yeah, she doesn't quite have the perspective yet.
She doesn't know about what Solovet is doing, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And she's going to get a big wake-up call at the end of this book when she realizes what Solovet's done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she and Hamnet will see maybe a bit more eye to eye.
Right.
On certain issues.
Yeah.
Or at least she'll understand his position a bit better.
I think so. I think you're right. Luxa asks how Nerissa is doing, and Gregor says she's doing all right, and even stood up to Ripred at the plague meeting. Luxa and Gregor agree that no matter what the others say, it doesn't affect their judgment of Nerissa. Gregor explains how Nerissa saved his and Ares' lives with her interpretation of the prophecy of Bane, then goes on to tell Luxa everything that happened after they got separated in the serpent attack in Book 2, including who has the plague back in Regalia right now. Luxa gives her side of what happened after the serpents, which is basically that she, Aurora, Boots, and Temp found Twitch-Tip in the labyrinth and got attacked by rats. Temp escaped with Boots, Luxa and Aurora held off the rats and then escaped using Twitch-Tip's directions. They were in the maze for 2 days before making their way out into the jungle. I think I always skipped over that detail that they were lost in the labyrinth for 2 days. Like, what were they eating? That must have been maddening. I
mean, you can live for 3 or 4 days without food and water.
Oh, that's true. They could have just been starving the whole time.
That's what I was saying. But then, it's also they've been weakened from battle and the journey that they were already on, so...
Yeah, that must have been absolutely terrifying and nightmarish. After Luxa and Aurora got out of the labyrinth, they made their way into the jungle. There they got attacked by a giant tree snake. Aurora's wing got dislocated, and they've been living with the Nibblers ever since. Gregor asks about Twitch-Tip, and Luxa says she doesn't know what happened to her, but that she was very weak from her injuries. The questers emerge from the dense jungle and stand at the edge of a valley covered in graceful vines with pretty flowers. The air is cool and smells sweet, and it's quiet. Frill announces that this is the Vineyard of Eyes, and Gregor wonders why everyone is afraid of it because it seems really nice. Then he remembers the plant that ate mange and thinks, maybe here in the jungle, beauty was synonymous with danger, which is just a really cool line. There's a stone path leading into the valley, and the vines grow in an arch around it as if pruned by a gardener. Gregor asks who made the path, and Ripred says, the vineyard made the path itself to invite weary travelers in. Gregor wonders if the vineyard could be like a large-scale version of the plant that ate mange, a bunch of plants working together to create a trap. Ripred points out that others must have survived the vineyard to have been able to tell the story, so Gregor should have courage. Hamnet tells them to stay close together and to not touch the plants or leave the path. Gregor relays this information to Boots by comparing it to Little Red Riding Hood, telling her there are things like wolves in the plants. It's interesting because in the next book, we're going to learn that the Underlanders have their own version of Red Riding Hood, but instead of a wolf, it's a rat.
Makes sense, honestly. I don't remember when exactly Little Red Riding Hood and those other fairy tales came to be.
I think probably pretty early.
It would be centuries ago. It's just a matter of was it before the 1600s or not.
I assume yes, because Suzanne Collins would not overlook a detail like that.
1697.
Wait, okay.
That's what I'm looking, and that's close.
Okay, but people were telling the Red Riding Hood story before it got written down.
That's what I'm looking at to see if 1697 is the classic fairy tale one or the narrative tale from before.
Was that a Grimm's fairy tale?
It wasn't Grimm. That's why I'm looking. Well, the best known versions were by Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. Charles Perrault is the one who did Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast.
Right.
But yeah, the Brothers Grimm were the 1700s, so it wasn't them. Charles Perrault was a bit before. Yes, Charles Perrault would have been in the 1600s. But yeah, so the story does display similarities to stories from classical Greece in a row. So yeah,
Okay, so yeah, people were telling this story.
it's not it's like Cinderella. You can say that like the specific version of Cinderella that we know today came around, but like the broad strokes were there before.
Right. But I think it's interesting that like Gregor is using the Red Riding Hood story as like a way to tell Boots about danger in the jungle. And in the next book, I believe it's Luxa telling the story to Hazard, and it's kind of just like anti-rat propaganda. Like, she's not telling him for any other reason than to like tell him a story. And there's like an observation in the narration that Gregor thinks like the moral of the story is to never trust a rat. And it's just like really interesting the different ways that Gregor is using this story versus Luxa in the next book.
I also, one of the things I do think Suzanne Collins could have done a bit more is really emphasize how difficult it is to keep a 2-year-old in check in a deadly jungle.
For real.
Because we get hints like this, but really, I remember especially like the poison dart frogs, that should have been a lot dicier of a situation. And it's hard because it's a children's book, but like, she should have maybe gotten poisoned. Realistically speaking.
I think the fact that like she was so close to dying is just like kind of the lesson of that scene is like the jungle is really dangerous and like you are seconds away from death, and the fact that Boots survived this is just luck.
She's just had so much luck.
Yeah.
Like even from the sickness, was that the first book where she gets sick, or was that the second book too?
In the first book she
gets sick. In the second book she's presumed dead. The third one she could have been poisoned by frogs.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a natural escalation that this one takes a bit of a step backward for.
She's a bit of a cockroach herself.
Yeah, very much so. That's why they like her so much.
Yeah. I was also wondering if anyone else in the quest group knows what a wolf is, or if they have like no idea what Gregor is talking about when he's telling Boots this. Like, I assume Rip Red knows what a wolf is because he's very well read. Mm-hmm. But, like, I don't think Luke
has no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else knows what a wolf is.
More of your overland and nonsense you're speaking.
Yeah, maybe Hamnet and Hazard know because they knew Hazard's mom, who's an overlander. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's funny that, like, sometimes Gregor will just say things that the others have no idea what he's talking about, but they're like, oh, that's just some overlander thing. Guess we won't ask him about that. Boots commands Temp to stay on the path, but seems interested in trying to see a wolf through the vines. As they make their way down the path, Gregor notes again how quiet it is. The narration says, for the first time, he heard the sounds of his companions, stepping, sniffing, sighing. Nike coughed. Frill gave a hiss of surprise when Ripred trod on her tail. Gregor's stomach rumbled with hunger. But the Vineyard of Eyes drank in their sounds and gave them nothing in return. It was very creepy. Which is an understatement. Soon, Gregor learns why it's called the Vineyard of Eyes. The narration says, Gregor began to see them, the eyes. At first he mistook them for flowers or some of the enticing fruit that hung from the vines. But flowers didn't blink, and fruit didn't roll around to follow your movements. Were they insects? Did the plants themselves have eyes? Was that possible? First of all, love this description because just the line, like, flowers didn't blink and fruit didn't roll around to follow your movement. Like, that is so creepy. It's, like, it's very effective.
Yeah. You said first of all. Was there a second of all?
Yeah, so I did some research about plant eyes.
Yes. I was wondering this myself, because they have mouths sometimes.
Yeah, like, kind of.
Kind of.
Like, they're mouths, but, like, not... Yeah, exactly.
They have orifices that they eat with.
Exactly. I guess that counts as a mouth.
It's close enough, yeah. Anyway, do they have close enough eyes?
It's complicated. Uh-huh. So here's what I learned, and it's honestly kind of freaky. So, first of all, plants can kind of see without eyes because they sense light, which is basically what our eyes do, just with like more signals. Like we have a lot more going on in our eyes and in our brains, but like they can sense the light and like tilt towards the light. That's kind of like seeing.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know about specifically, do plants have eyes? And what I learned is that there are some plants that mimic the leaf shapes of plants around them, even without touching them. And there is some research going on to see if they can also mimic fake plants. Because that would take away like, oh, well, maybe they're just like getting chemicals out of the air and that's how they're mimicking them somehow, or like something weird like that. But if they like mimic fake plants, then it really means that they can see what the leaf shapes are. And I was reading this whole article about it, and the experiment that was going on was like, it could be better. The science is kind of still out on that, but there is like this. I didn't take enough notes about this, and honestly, it's really complicated, so I'm not going to get entirely into it.
We're English majors. We didn't do botany or bio.
I have not taken biology since freshman year of high school.
Same.
So apparently there are some like single-celled organisms where their whole cell acts like a lens, and I'm not sure what that means exactly. Hey, it's Editing Una with some sources to cite. The main article I was reading is called Can Plants See? In the wake of a controversial study, the answer's still unclear. The article was written by Christy Wilcox, PhD. The single-celled organism that I'm talking about here is Synechocystis cyanobacteria. Apparently, these cyanobacteria use their whole cell body as a lens to focus an image of a light source at the cell membrane. It seems like no one really knows what the purpose of this lens-like cell is, but the fact that it exists means that plants could have a similar kind of quote-unquote eye. Anyway, back to Una and John from the past. If you want to learn more about this, you should look up plant ocelli, I think is how it's pronounced, Ocelli, because they still don't even know. Like, they're still researching this, and it's honestly kind of creepy to think that, like, plants can see. I don't know, that's just, like, it's giving me, like, the heebie-jeebies.
I mean, plants can talk to each other.
Yes, I know some of that, yeah.
Yeah, with the underground, like, fungal and root networks that they have where they can communicate.
That was another thing I learned, is that roots know to grow away from light.
Yep.
So yeah, that's kind of like, it's not really vision the way that we're talking about, but...
Same way, like, it's not talking the way but it's communication. It's communication and some sort of external sensory input.
Exactly.
Close enough.
Yeah, which is really creepy, and so I guess the plants in the Vineyard of Eyes are just like super versions of that. Yeah, so just the idea that the whole vineyard is like this hive mind of plants that can see and think and like create their own paths and stuff is so horrifying. It's one of the creepiest things in the books, I think.
Plants are incredibly interesting, and if like it's a hop, skip, and a jump from an actual Venus flytrap to this.
Right.
Like, this is more believable to me, like infinitely more believable to me than the possibility of actual giant rats and bats and mice and fireflies.
So the vineyard is watching the questers as they walk down the path. The narration says, "It was easy to travel, but Gregor had the sense they were descending down the throat of some horrible beast." So again, we're like describing the vineyard as a single creature, which is great. That's a good metaphor. The group enters a perfectly circular clearing with 3 smaller paths branching out from it at equal angles. Gregor is amazed by the precision of the vineyard's geometry. The narration says, "The Vineyard of Eyes had been carefully designed and executed by someone, or something." Gregor blurts, "Why don't they just attack us?" Though he doesn't know who they are. Hamnet suggests the vineyard isn't hungry, or maybe it's saving them for a special purpose. Gregor asks if it has a brain, and Ripred asks if he thinks the paths just happened by accident. There's just like, in this series, there is a ton of horrific, violent death. There's like blood and gore and disease, but like this, the Vineyard of Eyes, I think is probably like the creepiest thing in the books.
Yeah.
Like, there is other scary stuff happening, there's other, like, graphic things happening, but the Vineyard of Eyes is perhaps the most unsettling, creepy thing in the Underland.
Especially up to this point, I definitely agree with you. I don't really know what would be the next closest. I think this definitely takes it.
Ooh, what else is creepy?
Like, I think some of the descriptions of the Bane in later books
get
close.
Right. You're right.
But this is... that's the interesting thing about the Bane, is that we don't actually see a whole lot of it, for as important as it is.
That's true.
Like, it's not in this book. It shows up a bit in
Marks of
Secrets, And then we actually see it in the Code of Claw.
Yeah.
But it's never the primary focus, except for in Prophecy of Bane, where it's mostly not seen.
Right.
So it's scary, but we don't get as much of it somehow as we do the jungle.
Yeah, the jungle is like eerie and it taps into this fear of the unknown. Like, it's not fear of death or blood or whatever. It's like the anticipation of danger and you don't really know what's out there or like what could kill you. And I think that Suzanne Collins just does an amazing job describing the vineyard and making us feel that unsettling feeling. After the group gathers around a lantern to eat, Hamnet, Frill, and Hazard leave to scout the paths. At first, Hamnet tries to get Hazard to stay, saying, "Ripred will look after you," but Hazard insists on going with. It's so interesting to me that Hamnet trusts Ripred to look after his son, especially since Hamnet is kind of the reason that Ripred's family died.
Also, they haven't seen each other. It's not like they were friends-ish 12 years ago, right? Wasn't that part of the backstory?
Yeah, it would have had to be over 10 years ago.
But it's been so long. Like, Ripred plays it off when he discovers Hamnet's alive. But he is surprised. This was not something he expected to actually
exactly
be the case.
Yeah, and they
did not part on good terms, necessarily.
Yeah, we have no idea what that was like for Ripred. Also, Hamnet would have been much younger. We're not given exact ages, but I think Hamnet is probably like early 20s when he left Regalia.
That would make sense as well.
So I wonder, like, how much is Hamnet like how he was before the Garden of the Hesperides? Like, does Ripred remember him as completely different? Like, they seem really good friends in this book. Like, they're always talking.
They jump right back into what I imagine their camaraderie was like then.
Yeah, they have a lot of banter, and Ripred is, like, explaining what has happened in the years that Hamnet's been gone. And I think it's really interesting that Hamnet specifically says, "Ripred will look after you." Because also it's a rat. Like, Ripred's a rat, and humans aren't supposed to trust their children with rats. Yeah. And I think it's just really significant.
I guess the way I think about it is, one, who else is he going to point to?
That's true.
Because the other options are Temp or the injured bat.
And Lapblood. But she's
another rat who's very, very out of it.
Yeah, she's out of it, yeah.
So really, it kind of has to be Ripred. Yeah. But then I think that also does speak to how unconventional of a human Hamnet is. Where he's very much one to not fall into the expected roles, either as a human or as a member of the royal family. Like, he's very much going against the grain.
Yeah, agree.
And this is just another easy example of that. Like, Luxa was gonna let Gregor die just because she saw him with Ripred.
Right.
And Hamnet's like, no, we like Ripred.
Yeah. Hamnet very much trusts Ripred. Because I think that Hamnet also remembers a time before the Garden of the Hesperides when the rats and the humans were at peace. So Hamnet also has that perspective of, like, it didn't used to be like this.
Whereas for Luxa, it always has.
Yes, exactly.
Luxa has never known a time when the humans and the rats weren't at war. One of her earliest memories is her parents being killed by them.
Exactly. And that's very formative for her.
Yes.
Yeah. After Hamnet, Frill, and Hazard leave, Luxa asks Ripred why Hamnet left Regalia, saying that Henry heard Hamnet had gone mad, but they didn't know the whole story. Side note, there are so many H names in these goddamn books.
Hamnet, Hazard,
Henry Howard,
Hesperides, not a name, but still.
Horatio.
Wait, who's Horatio?
He's a guard in the 5th book. He's not really a big character, but yeah, I wonder if Suzanne Collins likes H names. Ripred says he'll tell Luxa because Vicus is probably just waiting until she's old enough to tell her himself, but Vicus has a hard time talking about Hamnet anyway. Luxa says, "Then you tell me, and Vicus and I will both be in your debt," which I love. Because I know that she's mostly just, like, curious about Hamnet, but she's also kind of like, then Vicus won't have to go through, like, the sadness of telling me himself. And I think that Luxa knows that she'll get a more accurate story from Ripred.
That's true. Vicus is going to try to soften the blow. Vicus will give us the modern-day version of a fairy tale, and Ripred will give us the full bloody truth.
Exactly.
Which he does.
Yeah, except he leaves out his own...
he does leave that out.
He leaves out his own family from the story.
I forgot he does that.
Yeah, we don't learn about how his family died at the Garden of the Hesperides until the 5th book.
Yeah, we just just hear it was a many rats, like hundreds, but we don't hear that his family was included. That's
Right.
true. He softens it for himself.
Yes, exactly.
He doesn't soften it for Luke, so he softens it for himself.
Yeah, he takes himself out of the story. He doesn't even say, like, I was there.
No.
He just tells it, and he's not like, I saw this firsthand. Very interesting. I love how Ripred tells the story.
I love Ripred.
I love Ripred.
He's so good.
He's just the greatest.
Okay, weave us a story.
Yes, here we go. So Ripred says he can't pass up a chance to have Luxa owe him, so he starts the story by saying, the humans and the rats were not always so consumed with hatred for each other. He goes on to describe times of peace when both species had, quote, leaders that were willing to place a higher priority on harmony than gain. In one era of peace hundreds of years ago, the humans gave the rats a gift. It was the Garden of the Hesperides, which was originally just a plain that flooded every year when the river was high. But when Sandwich and the first Regalians came down to the Underland, they built a dike to keep the plain from flooding. Hey, pop quiz, John, do you know the difference between a dike and a dam?
Is a dike more of like a canal? No, I guess the answer is no, I don't know the difference. Please tell me the difference.
You're on the right track.
I took a water conservation class in college, and it was not retained at all.
So a dam has water on both sides of it, and a dike only has water on one side of it.
That's the fun fact all water conservation experts will tell you. That's the levity. Did you know, fun fact, the difference between a dike and a dam?
Yeah. Because, like, the Hoover Dam has, like, water on both sides
On both sides,
stuff.
but a dike only blocks it.
Just on one side. There's also a levee, because I looked this up myself. I was like, what the fuck is a dike? And I had to research it myself, so.
What's a levee?
I forget now.
Yeah, so they're all...
Yeah.
Whatever.
I had never learned that before.
No, I'll never remember it.
I assumed that they were the same thing.
Yeah.
I think, in my mind, anything that holds a water back is a dam.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Anyway, the humans planted apple trees there that grew with just the light from the river. The garden, which should really be called an orchard if it's all apple trees, by the way.
Yeah, because an orchard is like one specific type of produce, yeah.
The garden/orchard produced golden apples, and it made a great gift to the rats because they can't grow crops. And I was wondering, what's stopping the rats from farming? Because they're smart enough to do it. Is it just that they don't have the ability to use the tools that would be necessary to harvest plants? I feel like...
I guess they could dig, but it goes back to, like, with the first book, that's why they kept Gregor's dad alive for so long, was because he could make weaponry. So maybe it is the opposable thumbs thing, yeah. Also,
I feel like they could still, like, anyone has the capability to, like, take seeds and put them in the ground.
Yeah.
Like, maybe it just doesn't work as well if you don't have, like, the tools to build irrigation and, like, plow fields and stuff.
Also, the difference between a levee and a dike is that a levee protects land that's normally dry but might be flooded with, like, rain or snow, whereas a dike protects lands that would naturally be underwater most of the time.
Oh, that is so interesting.
Yeah. So it's like, they're sometimes used interchangeably because, like, in this case, it was a dike that was designed to protect land forever.
Right.
So it would basically be a levee for all intents and purposes. It was just a dike when it was built, so that's why they're much more interchangeable.
That is so interesting. I've never heard that distinction before, but the more you know.
This has been Water Conservation with John and Una.
Ripred remembers when he was a pup, visiting the garden was a great treat, and Lapblood agrees. Luxa says she's never heard of the Garden of the Hesperides before, and Ripred goes on to explain why. 10 years ago, when Luxa's father was the king of Regalia and Gorger was king of the rats, the humans decided to take back the garden. Solovet sent Hamnet, who was a great warrior, with an army to get rid of the rats. Ripred says, everyone assumed he would take control of the army after his mother, since he seemed just like her. But as it turned out, he was as much like Vicus as he was like Solovet, and so he was doomed. That's such a good line.
That's a good line, too. Also, really hammering home how maybe Solovet is not so trustworthy.
Yeah, this is kind of like planting a seed of doubt.
Certainly the way Ripred's describing her, which is interesting because he and Solovet before this book got along fabulously.
Yeah, they had banter and stuff.
They had banter, and they were like always like wanting to play fight each other and practice dueling. And now I feel like since the Warmblood curse has come along, that it's more solidified. Well, maybe if we're at war, it shouldn't be this level of
I think
harm.
that Ripred and Solovet's relationship is fascinating because I'm not sure that Ripred would call her a friend.
Mhm.
Like, Vicus calls Ripred a friend, but I'm not sure that Ripred would call Vicus and Solivet his friends.
I think he thinks of them more as allies.
Yeah, exactly. And they have a very, like, limited diplomatic kind of relationship. Like, Ripred is invited to dinner in the High Hall or whatever in book 2, and he gets to, like, talk with Vicus and Solivet as if they're friends. But I think it's more of a, like, this is a fellow soldier type thing. Gregor isn't sure he wants to hear the rest of the story, but he knows Luxa needs to know about her uncle. Hamnet launched a surprise attack on the rats who were in the garden with their pups, but after the rats got their pups to safety in the surrounding caves, they started to gain the upper hand against the humans. But Solivet had given Hamnet a backup plan in case the rats were too strong. Open the sluice gates that provided irrigation to the garden and flood the field. Gregor remembers how Hamnet told Vicus, "I do no harm, I do no more harm," and he knows he's about to find out what harm he meant. The river was high and the dike was centuries old, so when they opened the sluice gates, the whole dike crumbled. The original plan was just to force the rats to swim so they couldn't fight as well, but when the garden got covered by 20 feet of water, hundreds of rats drowned, along with many humans and bats.
I've got 2 theories about this, first off.
Okay.
Both related to Solivet's role in this.
I'm so intrigued.
One theory is that this was the act where Solivet accidentally committed genocide instead of simply, like, forcing the rat's hand. And this is what sent her on the path to, like, becoming more and more bloodthirsty, because she knew she already reached that point. So instead of being like Hamnet, where he runs away and tries to just take no part in this anymore and do no harm, she leans into it.
She digs into her heels.
Yes.
Yeah.
The other theory is that this is exactly what Solivet wanted to happen.
Ooh.
And so she just didn't tell Hamnet or any others that this is what she was hoping to have happen. But I would not put that out of the realm of possibility for her to have calculated that that would have happened.
Literally, I would not doubt it.
And I think both of those are equally plausible. I know which one I think is more fascinating, but I like those both. And I don't think we ever get any, like, Solivet is very much like a character on the side of things. We don't really get into her
She has
in super depth.
a much bigger role in book 5, but even then, we don't get a whole lot of, like, her motivations and stuff.
Because there are so many other things that they have to tie into and wrap up in the Code of Claw.
Yeah.
That she's still kind of just one of many characters. But that's how I interpreted this when I was rereading. Like, it's a critical point for her in her life and development as a character. This is, like, the crux of everything.
Yeah.
The point of no return.
That is a really good theory, actually. And now I'm thinking about how, like, after this happened, Hamnet ran away, and Solivet probably got, like, had a lot of feelings about that and got really upset and is like, I wonder if she just, like, dug in her heels and was like, Hamnet's a coward, and what we did, we had to do, and it was a tragedy, but it's, like, fine, it was just rats, or, like, whatever. And she just, like, became more cold as a result of...
She hardened.
Yes.
And that would line up with how she reacted when she saw Hamnet was alive, compared to Vicus, who was very obviously emotional about this.
Right.
And she was just heartless.
Yeah. She was like, you don't have a right to mourn your dead sister and stuff. Like, that is, I feel like Solivet has a lot of very big feelings around Hamnet and is probably dealing with them by being very cold and heartless. Yeah. The worst part is that because the garden filled completely with water, the surrounding caves also flooded, so the rat pups that were hiding there drowned too. Ripred says, you could hear their shrieks for miles around, and Lapblood echoes, miles around, miles around.
This is where it's like, for a children's book series, the threat or reality of dead babies is constant. We have Boots being threatened with death. We have the Bane.
Baby Bane.
We have Lapblood's pups.
Exactly.
We have all of the hundreds of pups here in this backstory.
Yeah. And mice pups in the next book.
Mice pups in the next. There are so many, not just children, but infants.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, and yeah, I just remembered a scene from the 5th book where they are like reuniting. They're trying to reunite mice babies with like their families and stuff, and that's just such a interesting look at the war. Like book 5 is very much about war, but it's not all fight scenes. Like there's a lot of scenes that are like breaking the code of claw, going to like war council meetings, and dealing with all of the victims of the war who are like flooding the palace. Yeah.
I mean, the whole resolution to the code of claw is Ripred harnessing the prophecy for basically a ceasefire.
Right.
Like, it's not through an epic battle. I mean, there is battling, but like that's not how the story ends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the implication at the end of book 5, we'll
get to book 5.
We'll get to book 5, but it is interesting that like even at the end of book 5, like Luxa and Ripred are ready to go back to war until Gregor like kind of lays down the law and is like, I'm not fighting for either of you. And yeah, wow, can't wait to get to book 5.
Yeah. That's a common theme for Suzanne Collins too, because that's how Walking J ends.
Right.
With the main character saying, "No, I'm done with this. We're not doing this anymore. I don't care."
Yeah, like putting an end to it.
Putting an end to it,
stop.
not through a giant battle, even though there is a giant battle, but the actual ending is its own thing in a moment of peace almost.
Exactly. It's like the protagonist's single choice to just like not participate in the violence anymore. That is so real. I haven't thought about that. I'm getting chills.
Yeah. I just got another one. Okay, we moved on from connecting this to Percy Jackson. Now we're just connecting it to Hunger Games.
Yeah.
Great, more on topic. Kind of. I don't know. That's how the first Hunger Games ends.
True. Very true.
Katniss says, "No, I'm not killing anyone else. We're done here." And she breaks the rules.
Yes.
That's what Ripred does in Code of Claw. Spoilers.
Yeah.
And that's what Gregor does in Prophecy of Maine. He's just like, no, I'm no more killing. And the narrative allows them to make those choices.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I had never thought about that in as many words, even though I'm kind of like aware of the thematic parallels between Gregor and Hunger Games. But like, that's really well put.
Well, on first, like on the surface, then they're not at all. They're not very similar.
Yeah.
Series. Like this one's very much the classic Alice in Wonderland of falling into an unknown world and dealing with the turmoil there. And Hunger Games is like this. It's a fully formed dystopia. It's its own thing that Katniss has always been a part of. But once you get past the setup, it's clear she's writing this with similar notions and ideas in mind.
Yeah, just good thoughts. Can't wait to get deeper into book 5 for sure, but I've been doing a little bit of planning for book 4 episodes, and I am so fucking hyped to read Marks of Secret.
Because that's your favorite one.
It's my
right?
favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't get into it now, but I have so many thoughts about it. But let's finish book 3
finish
first.
Warmbloods,
Yeah.
yes.
Hamnet, at the Garden of the Hesperides, began trying to save anyone he could, even the rats, but it was useless. His own bonded flyer got dragged into the water and never resurfaced. Mareth had to rescue Hamnet and knock him out to keep him from diving back into what Ripred calls a lake of corpses, which is nightmarish.
Yeah.
Just a side note, this is exactly what Mareth had to do to Howard in book 2 when Pandora got eaten by mites.
You're right.
Mareth had to knock him out to keep him from, like, diving into the water to go rescue Pandora, even though she was already dead.
Mareth's like the anesthesiologist of the Underlands.
He could just knock someone out in a single punch.
He's like, he knows exactly where in the head to hit people now to do that.
Yeah, he's an expert by now. Love Mareth.
Yeah.
Are you aware of my Ham Mareth agenda?
I am not, no.
Okay, you can listen to the last episode that I did with Nate. We like got into it a bunch, but basically I think Hamnet and Mareth were boyfriends. And I think that Mareth saving Hamnet's life at the Garden of the Hesperides is a deeply romantic gesture. Hamnet went mad after that. At first, he spoke in garbled sentences and didn't recognize anyone, but soon he stopped speaking entirely. A few nights later, he left Regalia. Ripred thinks the last person who saw him was probably Nerissa, who never mentioned seeing him. They pronounced Hamnet dead after a year and stopped searching for him. And that's the end of the story of Uncle Hamnet. Aurora asks what happened to the garden, and Ripred says it's still underwater, and the golden apple trees have been lost forever. No one speaks for a while until Hamnet, Frill, and Hazard re-enter the clearing. Hamnet asks, telling tales out of school again, Ripred? Ripred reasons that telling stories like this one will lessen the chance of repeating them, and he says it might help Luxa someday. Hamnet looks at her and says, maybe, depending on whose ears she inherited. Ripred asks if Hamnet had any luck on his scouting mission, and the chapter ends with Hamnet saying, I think so, and holding up a handful of starshade.
Yes, success.
This is such an amazing chapter.
This is a great one.
When I was taking my notes for this a few nights ago, I was like, I can't fucking wait to talk to John about this.
Yes, there's so much. It's so good.
It's a good Ripred chapter. It's a good Hamnet chapter. It's like setting up a lot that Gregor and Luxa are going to have to grapple with in the next 2 books. And you're right how Hamnet is really, like, only in this series for, like, a fraction of, like, he's just in the middle of this book, basically. He's not at the beginning, and he's gonna die in, like, 2 chapters.
Yep. Sure is.
So he's not in the series a whole lot, but he has this whole, like, his ghost just, like, haunts the whole series. Like, what he did at the Garden of the Hesperides is, like, the reason that the humans and the rats are currently at war. And, like, you can reason that they would have been at war anyway, because King Gorger is, like, bloodthirsty, and Solivet would have been evil regardless of Hamnet. But just learning that this one event was responsible for so many pivotal experiences in several characters' lives. Like, it leaves me reeling. Like, we find out so much in this chapter, and it's told in this very simple, straightforward story by Ripred. And it's just told, like, around a campfire, basically, or, like, a lantern. And I can, like, picture it perfectly in my mind, and just the creepiness of the vineyard around them. Like, this chapter is fucking, like, chef's kiss. It's so perfect to me.
It's very, very good. I love how... I think I might have mentioned this before, or someone has. I love how different all the quests have been. There's no overlap. Every one of them has totally different goals, totally different terrains, totally different side characters and, like, other questers besides the main characters.
Yeah, different vibes.
Different vibes, different dynamics. It's all very unique to each book.
Yeah.
And it gives a lot of, like, identity to each book. Like, you can read... outside of plot, just like you said, the vibes, the tone of the jungle and everything in Curse of the Warmbloods is different than the tone and the caves of the first book.
And the waterway in the second book.
In the second book. It's all each, like, they have their own tropes and almost, and their own little twists and quirks to them.
Exactly. Yeah, I could not agree more. Suzanne Collins is an expert for that. What else is there to say about this chapter? I mean, we covered a lot. I feel like I could talk forever and ever.
Yeah. I feel so bad for Lapblood. I'm sure you have talked about her and the trials and tribulations she's gone through in the last few podcasts, but you can just see, like, her reactions with when Ripred got to the part of the pups drowning, where it's like, this is hell for her.
Yeah, and this is, like, the tragedy at the Garden of the Hesperides is, like, something that affected so many rats. Like, every rat knows the story, and probably all knew at least one person, like, one fellow rat that died in it. Like, this is a tragedy that affected an entire species. Yeah, it's really wild. Yeah, I feel like this is the first time that the magnitude of the Garden of the Hesperides is, like, hitting me. Like, I never thought this hard about how important that event was to the Underland as a whole.
Honestly, I feel like this is the book where it hits home the magnitude of just the war itself. Because the main things we've gotten before were, like, tied to individual characters.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Luxa's parents were killed by rats. We see some of the fighting in the first book, but it's mostly just been talked about in vagaries.
Yeah, you're right.
And this is the first time we get, like, oh no, these are the actual costs in terms of lives that this has taken on everybody.
Yeah, like, we can talk about, like, okay, Lux's parents were killed by rats. Henry was killed by the rats. Gregor is supposed to kill the Bane. Like, these are all kind of on like an individual scale, but then the Garden of the Hesperides is just like hundreds of times bigger than that, in that, yeah, it's this large scale tragedy that has defined entire generations of all of these different species.
This is the first time we get any real sort of sympathy for the rats, I would also say. Like, because we have Ripred, who's amazing, but like he's kind of his own identity. He's an outlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Prophecy of Bane, we get a little bit of the Bane's like carers, like I can't remember, are they the Bane's actual parents?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The actual parents of the Bane who are killed, and then like that's one of the things that Gregor has that changes his mind to just not kill the Bane because he realizes what's going on.
Right.
But like they die in 2 pages, the parents of the Bane.
Right.
And then we've got, we've got Twitch Tip, who I love. We don't really get a lot of why. Like, there's no real reason for us to sympathize with Twitch Tip other than she's awesome. Like, we don't get, like, a backstory for her that much, really.
Yeah, I guess the backstory that kind of, like, wins us over is that she's, like, a scent seer who was kicked out by the rats and stuff, so we think of her as, like, an underdog, and we want to, like, be on her side.
But then it's more like, Ripred, we're like, okay, we don't feel bad for her, despite her being a rat. We feel bad for her, but we still hate the rats for being cruel to Twitch Tip.
Right.
Like, the rats as a group of living things,
yes,
is not something we have sympathy for. There's a few good rats, and most of them are awful.
Right.
And here we get, well, it's not that simple.
Yeah, exactly. And
yes, there's King Gorgia, but like, we've more been treated to like, okay, we've got Ripred, we've got Twitch Tip, and then there's the rest, and we need to kill them.
Yeah.
And there's been a bit of grayness, but mostly that's been how it is. And this is the book where it kind of cracks that open.
I agree. This was actually something that I was talking with Audie about a few episodes ago, when we have the scene with Gregor brushing Lapblood's fur.
Yes.
Because up until that point, you're right, like, we like Ripred, we like Twitch Tip, we're beginning to sympathize with Lapblood, but that's like a very individual basis, and we're still looking at the rats as like a whole species of the bad guys. But then that scene with Gregor brushing Lapblood's fur is very pivotal in that Gregor's whole perspective about like sympathizing with Lapblood and realizing that they're 2 sides of the same coin. Like, Gregor is fighting to save his mom, Lapblood is fighting to save her pups. Like, he makes this breakthrough of like, oh, the rats and the humans aren't different at all. And hearing this story about how terrible the humans have been to the rats, that really puts things into perspective. Yeah, this whole book is like so many pivotal moments that really just recontextualize how we think about the Underland. And I think that's why it's everyone's favorite.
I forgot that this is like the most popular, which is because neither of us have it as our favorite.
Right. But I think that...
It is very good, though.
Yes, it's really good. It's probably my second favorite, actually. I don't know. We'll get to Code of Claw, and then maybe I'll change my mind. But I think what we were talking about with, like, the vibes for Curse of the Warmbloods is so on point. Just, like, the jungle is so iconic. Like, the waterway or whatever in book 2 is iconic, too. And there are definitely, like, the Firelands in book 4 and, like, whatever. But the jungle is just, like, this all-encompassing, like, creepy environment. It's just, like, so good.
I mean, it's the middle entry in the series, Curse of the Warmbloods, and we have talked about, I know, well, like, the middle book is where things like that's when things really kick into the next gear.
Exactly.
And we've definitely gotten to that point, I think, at this point in Curse of the Warmbloods. But, like, this is where we're, like, really getting into the meat of, not even the end game, but just, like, we're now definitely accelerating. The first book is set up. Second book is introducing a new concept with the Bane, but like still mostly teasing. This is where it happens.
Yes, this is like we're getting into the beef of the deep hatred that the humans and the rats have toward each other, and we're like beginning to pick that apart, and this chapter goes a long way to do that. Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for joining me, John.
Thank you, as always, for having me.
This was a great chapter to discuss with you. So glad to have you here. Next week's episode is going to cover chapter 22. Find us on Tumblr, Instagram, and YouTube at Return to Regalia, all one word. Thank you for listening, and until next time, fly you high.
Fly you high.